They thought I was the gardener. Standing at the edge of the rose terrace, hands tucked in my jacket pockets, I watched as guests in silk and polished leather wandered the estate I knew like the back of my hand. They nodded politely, some didn't even look. No one asked my name. Not the bride, not her family, not the man marrying her, my son. What they didn't know was that every brick of the chateau, every hedge trimmed to perfection, every antique chandelier above their heads belonged to me. And before the night was over, so would the story. My wife passed away on a Monday. Quietly, in her sleep in the house, she loved an old stone manor nestled between the rolling hills of Kent. Helen had always said she didn't want a fuss, and she meant it. She left behind no funeral plans, no big ceremonies. Just a letter and a key. That key unlocked a safety deposit box I'd never seen tucked in a discreet private bank in the heart of London. The clerk had smiled politely when I gave my name, but his eyes widened when he opened the account. Inside wasn't just a stack of dusty papers. It was an empire. Deeds, investment portfolios, a legal will drafted with surgical precision, and staggering numbers. I blinked twice to make sure I was reading it right. Over 88 million euros distributed across accounts, holdings, trusts. The woman who used to clip coupons for tea bags had been quietly managing a fortune while I built garden walls and fixed old chimneys. And the estate, this very property, wasn't just ours. It was hers, inherited from an old relative I'd never met. She had let me believe for decades that we were just taking care of the place for someone else. I sat alone in the private viewing room, the velvet-lined folders spread across the mahogany table, and felt more betrayed than grateful. Not because she'd kept the money secret, but because I couldn't ask her why. And maybe deep down, I knew the answer already. Helen never cared for status. She came from it. Boarding school's linen napkins and foreign language tutors. But after a family scandal in her youth, she stepped away from all of it. She chose me a groundskeeper at the very school her cousins once attended. She wanted a life built on character, not pedigree. But the world doesn't forget class. Not really. People still judged. And when Ethan, our only son, got engaged to a woman from a family of old European money, I started seeing that same condescension again. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Compliments with sharp edges. Little jokes about where I must have learned to fix up a garden so nicely. At first, I let it slide. A wedding is stressful. Emotions run high. But something about it stirred an old ache in me. The kind Helen had shielded me from all those years. I remembered the letter she left. Her handwriting had always been steady like her voice. Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But I know you'll do what I never had the courage to do. Show them what truly matters. Not money, not lineage, but grace under fire. Let them reveal who they are, and then you'll know who's worth standing beside. So I made a decision. I wouldn't tell Ethan about the inheritance. Not yet. I wouldn't tell Celeste, his fiancée, or the Marchands, her impossibly well-connected family from Surrey. I wouldn't mention that I owned the estate they were about to get married on. I would show up in the same tweed coat. I always wore the one with grass stains on the cuffs. I would watch, I would listen, and I would wait for the moment they told me who they really were. The wedding week began with champagne and checklists. Florists arrived in black vans carrying blooms imported from France. Tents were erected on the back lawn, sheer fabric fluttering like sails in the wind. Celeste's mother, Madame Vivienne Marchand, oversaw everything like a general. No detail was beneath her scrutiny. "Move the harpists closer to the rose arch," she barked at the event coordinator. "And for heaven's sake, get rid of that tacky bird fountain. It ruins the symmetry." I stood nearby, hands in my pockets, observing. No one gave me a second glance. To them, I was the caretaker, the help, one of the men who kept the weeds down and the hedges up. Vivian didn't even acknowledge me. Ethan barely had time to speak. When he did, it was rushed, polite, always half distracted. "Sorry, Dad. Rehearsal starts soon." "You okay with staying in the gardener's cottage?" I nodded. He didn't notice the flicker in my eyes. Yes, I would sleep in the same stone cottage where I once brought his mother flowers in a rusted coffee tin. A space we shared before the manor had ever felt like home. It was a strange thing watching your life from the outside. Like being a ghost at your own wake. Later that evening, I wandered into the kitchen hoping for a quiet cup of tea. The house staff had been replaced for the week with a hired team from a luxury events company. Uniformed servers moved like chess pieces across polished floors. I found a tray of leftover pastries and poured myself some Earl Grey. Just as I reached for a scone, I heard the laughter. "Oh, Celeste, you should have seen his face when you asked for the wine cellar key," said a young woman in designer heels. He looked like he'd never even seen a wine cellar, someone else added. "Isn't that adorable?" Celeste giggled. "Well, bless his heart, he tries so hard." Ethan told me his father used to be the gardener here. My breath caught. Used to be? Another girl chimed in. "Wait, so the estate isn't theirs?" Celeste gave a dismissive shrug. "No. He stayed on as caretaker when Ethan's mother passed. Honestly, I'm surprised they kept him around. But Ethan's soft-hearted. Soft-hearted." It was a small sentence, but it landed like a stone in the chest. I didn't say anything. I just backed away gently, placing my teacup back on the tray. The edges of my vision blurred as I stepped into the hallway. A framed photograph caught my eye, Helen holding baby Ethan standing in the manor's garden. A place we planted together, row by row. She would have heard that laugh too, the mockery behind it. The aristocratic cruelty wrapped in politeness. But Helen had always told me, don't speak when angry. Let time do the talking. So I walked the halls that night with quiet footsteps and open eyes. I heard how the Marchands joked about refinishing the library after the honeymoon, how they spoke of modernizing the wine list and possibly clearing out the old stables to make room for a guest spa. They spoke of my home like it was a piece of property to be remade in their image. And still I said nothing, because Helen was right. Time would speak, and when it did, it would be louder than any accusation. By the morning of the rehearsal dinner, the estate no longer felt like mine. French banners lined the hedge maze. Valets wore tailored black, and Celeste's family owed money from the Loire Valley carried themselves like royalty. They moved through the house with entitlement, not curiosity, as if their lineage gave them permission to overwrite the memories built into every creaking floorboard. Ethan, bless him, tried to straddle both worlds. He gave me a new tie navy with gold thread and asked if I'd be comfortable sitting near the back with the staff. "I just don't want you to feel out of place," he said, eyes apologetic. "They're formal." I nodded more out of mercy than agreement. There was no malice in him, just naivety. Ethan had grown up in privilege he never fully understood. The irony was that the very man who gave him that privilege was now being gently nudged into the shadows of his own home. At dinner, they seated me by the service entrance near the kitchen swing doors. The lights were dimmed to a golden hue, and a string quartet played softly beneath the chatter of wine glasses and laughter. The table was impossibly long. Polished oak, imported china, 4 forks per setting. I sipped water. I listened. Celeste's father, François Marchand, stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. To our beautiful children, and to the joining of 2 great families. There was applause, light glittering applause. I clapped too, quietly. Then came the toasts. Vivienne stood and said a few elegant words about tradition, grace, and the importance of upbringing. She smiled when she mentioned her own family's vineyard in Bordeaux. "We are honored," she said, "to welcome Ethan into our circle. Though we come from different worlds, we recognize refinement when we see it. Different worlds." There it was again. Ethan gave his toast last. He spoke about love growth and how Celeste taught me to see the world through a finer lens. I sat still, unmoving, my hands folded in my lap. That night, after the tables were cleared and the champagne dried on linen, I walked alone through the garden. The air was cool. Fog rolled in from the river, like a quiet reminder of something ancient. Helen used to say money shows up in silence. When people think they're alone, that's when you learn who they are. She was right. They thought I was gone. They thought the gardener didn't matter. They never asked who funded the wedding, who paid for the wine, the flowers, the gold-trimmed dinnerware, who kept the taxes paid on a property large enough to be listed on a registry of national heritage. They never asked because they never cared, which is why the next morning I made a quiet call to my attorney. Just one line. Activate the clause. It was time to change the guest list, not for the wedding, but for the will. The morning of the wedding arrived with soft light and a gentle mist curling around the edges of the estate. The kind of morning that looked like it had been painted delicate, romantic, deceptively calm. Inside the manor, the energy was frantic. Stylists fluttered from room to room. Champagne corks popped before breakfast. The marchands moved like diplomats, inspecting the florals, directing photographers, whispering to event staff with pursed smiles and precise French. I stayed out of the way, as expected. By noon, I had changed into my suit, one I'd had tailored in Florence years ago, when Helen and I took a long overdue anniversary trip. She loved that suit. "Makes you look like a man who owns silence," she'd said. I hadn't worn it since her funeral. Downstairs, the orchestra tuned their strings, and guests began to arrive. Black cars lined the gravel drive. Paparazzi tried to peer in through the iron gates. Vivian floated from guest to guest like a swan in pearls. They assigned me a seat in the very back row, last on the right, near the ivy wall. Perfect. I needed the distance. Because today wasn't just about flowers and vows. Today was the final test. I watched as Celeste made her entrance radiant in silk and pride. She knew how to carry herself. She knew how to hold attention. But she didn't glance at me, not once. Ethan stood tall at the altar, glowing in nervous anticipation. I searched his face for traces of the boy who once tied knots in my shoelaces and believed that dandelions granted real wishes. He was still there somewhere, but buried. The ceremony began. French and English intertwined like vines, elegant and rehearsed. The officiant began to speak of legacies and foundations. Francois smiled like a king. Vivian dabbed her eyes with lace. And I sat quietly, hands folded, my presence politely ignored. When the moment came to present the wedding gift, it was Vivian who rose first. As a token of our family's joy, she announced we are gifting the couple our vineyard in Provence. A modest estate but rich in legacy. Applause. Then Francois added, and a trust fund for their future children, education, travel influence. We believe in planting trees for the next generation. More applause. Then, after the fanfare had settled, someone finally remembered me. A staff member walked over with a mic. "Mr. Whitmore, would you like to say something?" Every head turned. Some guests leaned in curiously, unfamiliar with my face. A few whispered, assuming I was one of the older servants invited as a favor. I took the microphone. My voice was calm. "Steady. I won't speak long," I began. "But I do want to say something that's been on my heart." Celeste gave a tight smile, prepared for something quaint. Ethan's eyes widened, unsure. I looked at my son, then at the woman he was marrying, then at the crowd of people who had walked through my house for a week, as if they discovered it themselves. For those who don't know, I continue this manor, these gardens, this land. It's been in my family's name for nearly 40 years. My wife and I built this life together. And when she passed, I kept it going, quietly, respectfully, without need for attention. I could feel the silence growing heavier with each word. Some of you assumed I was the gardener. And that's fair. I do love pruning roses more than I like talking to bankers. A few uneasy chuckles. But you see, my wife and I made a decision long ago. We would give, and we would watch. Give kindness, give shelter, give opportunities. And see what people did with them. See who noticed and who simply took. Now the only sound was the wind moving through the leaves. "I have one more wedding gift," I said. "But it won't be from the gardener. It will be from the man who still owns this house." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "I've updated my will. And everything I own, this estate, my assets, the vineyards in Tuscany, the patents I licensed to 3 European firms, is going to someone who's shown true character, not performance." I turned my eyes toward the front row. "To my grandson, when he's born. And only if he is raised with humility, not entitlement. Kindness, not status." Vivian's face turned to stone. Francois blinked, stunned. "And Ethan?" Ethan looked like he'd just seen behind a curtain no one told him was there. I handed the mic back and walked away, not out of anger, but out of peace. Because some lessons aren't taught. They're earned. I walked through the garden alone, past the lemon trees Helen once planted toward the stables where the horses waited in their stalls. No one followed me, not at first. Inside the manor, I imagined the sound of shifting chairs, urgent whispers, the scraping of polished shoes against tile. Vivian would be in full damage control. Francois might be trying to recalibrate whatever fortune he thought he'd merged into. And Ethan? Well, Ethan would be facing himself for the first time in a long while. The silence in the garden felt sacred. I leaned against the old stone wall, eyes closed, until I heard the gravel crunch behind me. It was Ethan. He didn't speak at first, just stood there maybe 10 feet away, hands in his pockets like a boy again. Not the groom, not the man in the bespoke tuxedo, just my son stripped of showmanship. "You really did all that?" he finally asked. His voice was small. "I did," I said. "And the money, the inheritance, it's real." He nodded slowly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at him, really looked. "Because I needed to know who you were without it, and you needed to know what it meant to have everything and still miss what matters." He sat down on the stone bench across from me. "I was angry at you," he admitted. "Thought you were punishing me for marrying Celeste." "I wasn't," I said, "but I was watching. And what I saw wasn't about love, Ethan. It was about status, presentation, rooms full of people saying everything and meaning nothing." He winced. "I wasn't perfect," I added. "God knows I made mistakes. But I wanted you to have a chance at something better, real connection, real joy, not approval, not applause." He looked down at his hands. "She said you were cold, that you didn't support us." She was right. I didn't support the version of you she was shaping. A long silence passed between us. Then Ethan asked, "Is it too late to fix it?" I exhaled slowly. "Not if you start today." He nodded again, slower this time. "I think I forgot who I was before I met her," he said. "And I think I forgot who you were too." "You just remembered," I said gently. Behind us, the wedding music still played in the distance, the show continuing for the guests who hadn't yet understood that something far more important had just happened beyond the hedges. Ethan stood up, brushed his pants, straightened his shoulders. He didn't say goodbye. He just nodded and walked back toward the manor. I stayed behind. The sun had begun to set, casting gold across the fields. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without bitterness. Because legacy isn't what you leave behind in bank accounts. It's what you plant in people. And Ethan maybe was finally ready to grow into his name. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the tree line, I sat by the fireplace in the West Library. The room no one else ever bothered to enter. Helen's favorite room. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes. The scent of old paper and lavender oil lingered in the drapes. It felt like sitting inside a memory. The wedding reception was still in full swing across the lawn. I could hear the faint pulse of string instruments and champagne laughter echoing through the garden. But no one had come looking for me, not even Vivian, until the door creaked open. It was Celeste. She walked in with the confidence of someone who had always owned every room until now. Her heels clicked against the marble, slow, deliberate. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. "You're a very good actor," she said coldly. I met her gaze. "And you're very good at playing the long game." She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the danger of speaking plainly. "I suppose you enjoyed watching us all scramble today," she said. "How long were you planning to wait before making your big reveal?" I stood and walked to the cabinet where Helen's china was kept. I poured myself a glass of cognac, then offered one to Celeste. She declined. "I didn't do this to humiliate you," I said. "I did it because I needed to know the truth. About all of you." Her jaw tensed. "And what truth did you find?" "That when the money vanished, so did the manners. And when I reappeared, so did the motives." She crossed her arms. "I loved Ethan." "No," I said softly, "you loved what Ethan could become for you. The image, the connection, the step up." "You think I'm some kind of gold digger?" she snapped. I didn't flinch. "I think you're a product of your environment, groomed to believe that wealth equals worth. But I don't blame you for that. I just don't want that for my son." She looked at me for a long moment, then scoffed. "You won't break us." "I don't have to," I replied. The cracks were already there. I just turned on the light. She turned sharply and left the room, her exit less composed than her entrance. I sat back down. Outside, the music had changed. Slower now, a waltz. And in that quiet, I could almost hear Helen's voice again. Give people the stage long enough, and eventually they reveal their script. She'd been right. Again. I looked down at the sealed envelope in my lap. The new version of my will signed that morning. My estate would still pass to Ethan, but with a clause. one that couldn't be bypassed or rewritten. To inherit the full estate, he would need to fulfill a single condition: spend one uninterrupted year living here without staff, without luxury, managing the land, learning the soil, and rediscovering the roots his mother and I built this life upon. Only then would he truly understand the difference between fortune and value. And only then would I know that I'd left it all in the right hands. A week passed before I heard from Ethan again. The wedding photos were already making their way around social media, Celeste smiling like a debutante at Versailles. Ethan standing beside her, a little stiff, a little lost. It was a performance preserved in pixels. But the man who showed up at the estate that Friday afternoon wasn't dressed for performance. No tailored suit, no pocket square. Just jeans, a weathered leather jacket, and eyes that had clearly seen something heavier than wedding lights. He found me in the vineyard where the grapes were just beginning to bud. Spring had arrived, and with it the quiet hum of things growing slowly, honestly. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside me staring out at the rows. "I've been thinking," he finally said. "About what you said, about Mom, about all of it." I nodded, letting him find the words. "I married Celeste because I thought she could help me become the man everyone expected me to be," he admitted. "But I didn't realize until last week. I don't even know who I am outside of that image." He picked up a loose vine, examined it like it was something fragile. "I want to try, really try. I want to stay here, live here, work this land, figure out what it all means without the noise." It wasn't an apology. It was something more difficult: humility. I studied his face. The tiredness wasn't exhaustion, it was awakening. The first kind of real tired that comes from letting go of what doesn't matter. "I've made arrangements," I said. "The cottage by the East Fields is ready. No servants, no shortcuts. Just a roof, a stove, and the land." He smiled faintly. "Sounds terrifying." "Good," I said. He looked at me. "And Celeste, that's your decision," I said. "But I'd ask you one question, which is, when no one's watching, who does she become?" That silence said enough. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the vineyard, pruning the vines. The sun warmed the backs of our necks. Dirt got beneath our nails. No cameras, no boardrooms. Just two men, shoulder to shoulder, letting something real begin again. Later that night, I found a note under my study door from Vivian. It wasn't a long one. It read, "You were right. I've built a life around people who only applauded when they thought I had power. I'm leaving for Florence. I want to start again somewhere no one cares about surnames. Thank you for showing me the truth, no matter how ugly it was to face." I folded the note, gently placed it inside Helen's old journal. The dominoes had started to fall. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't bracing for collapse. I was planting for the season ahead. Summer crept in quietly, not with fanfare, but with warmth that soaked the soil and stretched the days. Ethan kept his word. Every morning at dawn, I'd see him from the veranda boots, laced hands already stained with earth. He didn't flinch at the blisters. He didn't complain when the tractor sputtered mid-harvest. He learned to fix things with his hands. And slowly he started fixing himself too. He spoke less, but when he did, it meant something. He asked about Helen, really asked. Not the bullet points he once rehearsed for polite conversation, but the messy, vivid stories. How she used to braid flowers into the fence for no reason at all. How she danced barefoot in the cellar when the wine finally aged just right. Ethan had stopped asking who he needed to be. He was beginning to ask who she was. And what of her lived inside him. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the back porch with an old photo album. His thumbs brushed the worn edges like they were holy. "She was beautiful," he said softly, pointing to a photo of Helen at 25, her curls windswept her eyes, laughing at the camera. "She still is," I said, "in everything that grows here." There was no ceremony, no climactic speech, just the quiet miracle of a man becoming real in his own skin. But outside the gates of the vineyard, the noise stirred. Celeste had not taken kindly to Ethan's decision to disappear. She had returned to the city sour-scorned and armed with lawyers. The tabloids began to circle. "Heir gives up fortune for dirt and guilt," read one headline. "Whitmore legacy in crisis," read another. My name, my estate, became evening gossip again. But I didn't flinch. Let them talk. Let them guess. What they didn't understand, and never would, was that Ethan had traded riches for wealth of a different kind, one that couldn't be measured in dividends or penthouse square footage. It was measured in morning air, in calloused palms, in the taste of tomatoes pulled from the vine you'd planted yourself. One evening, he handed me a letter. From Celeste. I didn't read it. I just asked, "Do you still love her?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "I loved who I thought she was. But that version only existed when I was pretending too." He paused, then added, "I think we both deserve something more honest." We toasted to that with wine we'd bottled ourselves. It wasn't aged yet. It was sharp, young, still finding its shape. But it was ours. And that made all the difference. The vineyard was in full bloom when the first bus arrived. Not tourists, not investors, but children. 23 of them from the village school a few miles down the road, smudged cheeks, restless energy eyes, wide with curiosity. Ethan had arranged the visit without telling me. "They're learning about agriculture," he said simply. "I thought they might want to learn it from someone who actually cares." At first, I stayed back observing from the veranda, arms folded, but something pulled me forward. Maybe it was the way one little boy crouched to study a row of basil like it was a sacred text. Or maybe it was the way Ethan knelt beside a girl in a wheelchair and showed her how to twist a grape stem just right without bruising the fruit. He didn't talk down to them. He didn't perform. He just shared. When I finally joined the group, a few of the children looked up at me with wonder. "Are you the farmer?" one asked. I laughed. It was the first time in years someone had called me that and meant it. "Yes," I said. "I suppose I am." That night over dinner, Ethan told me he wanted to start a youth program. Not a charity, a partnership. "Kids grow differently when their hands are in the soil," he said. "They learn patience. They learn that not everything comes with a button or a screen. They learn to listen to the earth and to themselves." I smiled. Helen would have loved that. And so we began again. We opened the eastern fields to the village, built a small learning center in the old storage barn, hired 2 local teachers, both retired, both giddy with purpose, and slowly the estate transformed. It wasn't just vines and stone anymore. It was story. It was sanctuary. Letters began to arrive. From people I'd forgotten I once helped, quietly, scholarships paid for small debts, forgiven jobs offered when no one else would take a risk. Somehow, word had spread that the old man in the hills had done something decent, and they wanted to give back. Tools arrived, volunteers. Even a few tech executives offered to sponsor solar panels and modern irrigation systems. But we accepted only what aligned with the soul of the place. No branding, no cameras, no strings. It was no longer about legacy in the traditional sense. It was about leaving something living. One evening, Ethan stood beside me at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the fields bathed in golden dusk. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "She wouldn't need to be proud," I said. "She'd just be home." He nodded quietly, and the 2 of us stood there, father and son, not in suits, not behind masks, but side by side, watching the world we'd rebuilt begin to breathe on its own. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the letter arrived. Not an email, not a typed memo, but a real letter on thick cream paper with a wax seal I hadn't seen in years. It was from Ethan. Even though we now lived on the same land, he had chosen to write this instead of saying it out loud. "Dad," it began, "there was a time when I didn't understand you, when I thought your silence was distance, that your retreat from the world was abandonment. But now I realize you weren't stepping away from life. You were protecting something delicate and rare, something I wasn't yet ready to see. Thank you for giving me the space to fail, and the room to return. You never said it outright, but everything you did told me this vineyard wasn't just your legacy, it was mine too if I wanted it. Well, I want it, not as an heirloom, but as a living thing. Something I will continue to grow, not because I have to, but because I believe in it now. In the soil, in the people, in the purpose. You once said real wealth is measured in who still comes around when they think you have nothing left to give. Well, you gave everything, and I see it now. I set the letter down, the edges warm from my hands. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gold, the vines swaying gently in the breeze. Children's laughter echoed from the far field, and the faint sound of Ethan teaching someone how to check the grapes for ripeness drifted in. I thought back to that wedding where none of them knew I was still worth $95 million, where people showed their true colors without ever knowing they were being watched. I could have exposed them. I could have made a spectacle. But if I had done that, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have rediscovered my son. I wouldn't have remembered what this land was really for. So no, I didn't lose anything when I kept the secret. I found everything. And when the time comes to pass on what I've built, it won't be in gold or contracts. It will be in hands like Ethan's, dirt-streaked, calloused, and full of intention. That will be the real inheritance, the one that outlasts all of us. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that sometimes the truest wealth can't be counted in dollars, then maybe you understand why some truths are best revealed in time, not in headlines. Some inheritances aren't written in wills. They're passed on in the way we listen, the way we grow, the way we quietly love. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you'd like to hear more stories like this about hidden dignity, quiet justice, and the power of second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We've got more journeys to share. Until next time, take care of the stories that matter. And remember, it's not what you leave behind in your bank account. It's what you leave behind in the hearts of those who knew you.